So your previous modules you would have learned about the colour wheel, colour theory and the Fitzpatrick scale. I'm going to show you how to use what you've learnt in a practical way to choose the pigments for each of your clients. In your pack you would have been given a Monica Ivani Signature Series set of pigments. I use these pigments every day in clinic and so does Lucy. They're fantastic pigments, they're really easy to use and they're great for beginners. Each set comes with a guide and it explains to you all the different colours that are in the set. It's a really handy guide to refer back to once you start working on clients yourself. So I'm going to move on now to show you some examples of real life clients of mine and the reasons why I chose the pigments I chose. So this lovely lady here is most definitely a Fitzpatrick 1. At a push 2, but I would treat her as a Fitzpatrick 1. She's got red hair, pale skin and light eyes. She doesn't tan. So if you look under my client's eyes, you can see the tissue directly under the eyes has got a very blue purpley tone. So straight away, I'm thinking that my client has got very cool undertones and that I need to be really careful in my pigment choice because whatever pigment I put in to the skin is going to heal cool. Immediately I think faux brown, it's a nice warm colour. I could add some electric blonde to add even more warmth, and I'm actually in this case going to add some modifier to the pigment because I know that the pigment is going to cool down. So the mod that I'm going to use for this client is Ungrey and it's made by the same company that make the Monica Ivani pigment, so it's compatible. At the retouch I can reassess and I can add more or less if it's needed or not needed. So something else to consider when you're choosing your pigment colour is the style of brow that you're going to be doing. So I'm going to be doing on this client a hair stroke brow, so I wouldn't necessarily use electric blonde on its own because that would be too light. What I would do if I was doing a powder brow on this client is I would use electric blonde and I would add faux brown to electric blonde. But I'm actually doing it the other way for hair strokes. I'm using faux brown as the base and I may add a couple of drops of electric blonde just because I know it's a very warm pigment. So by using faux brown and electric blonde and 1 drop of a modifier, I've created a lovely warm colour in my client's skin. It's going to cool down as it heals underneath the skin, but when she comes back I can reassess. But there's a good contrast as well. So what you want to do, especially with hair strokes, is create a nice contrast between the skin and the colour of the brows because they're going to fade by around 30% once they're healed. So you're going to need a bit of a contrast when they first go into the skin. So my lovely client, when she came in, I looked at her straight away and I thought, great, a Fitzpatrick 4. Beautiful warm skin, lovely olive tones. When I look at a Fitzpatrick 4, I'm not too concerned about pigment cooling down. It always cools down anyway, but I'm not overly concerned because I know that there's some lovely warmth in her skin naturally. I'm going to look more at her brow hair because I don't want the pigment to show up too much against her dark brow hair, so I need to take that into consideration. Straight away I'm thinking, right, absolute brown, and I'm going to add dark hearts. Also will add 1 drop of modifier just as a safety, and I can reassess when she comes back for her retouch. So again, I'm going to consider what style of brow I'm going to be doing. If I was doing a hair stroke brow, I would definitely use dark hearts. But because I'm doing a combination of hair strokes and powder, I'm going to start with absolute brown and I'm going to gradually add the dark heart to get a good match to my client's natural brow hair without it being too overpowering. So here is the finished brow. This is a combination brow, and as you can see I've created a good contrast between my client's skin so that the brows are showing nice and clearly against my client's skin. They're not too overwhelming and they're blending in nicely with my client's brow hair. So in this video what I'm doing is a drawdown, and all a drawdown is a blob of pigment, a wet cotton bud, and I'm just drawing it down. So what you'll see as I'm drawing down, the pigment's fading, but what it's also doing is it's cooling down. So this gives you a really good representation of how your pigment's going to look under the skin. Of course, it's not exact, but it gives you an idea. So if you look at the top half of the drawdown, it's very warm and it's very dark and it's very dense and compact. If you look at the bottom half, it's cooling down and it's getting lighter. I wanted to show you the drawdown without my head in the way, because what's happening here is the white paper is acting as a filter against the pigment. When you're making your pigment choices, you need to take into consideration the colour that the pigment is going to be sitting under. So that's the overtones of your client's skin and the undertones. You can see with the white filter of the paper that Dark Heart is very grey and very ashy, and also Absolute Brown looks quite ashy also. So you know that if you have a fits 1 to 3 that you're going to need to add some warmth, and vice versa. So what I wanted to show you here is what happens when you mix pigments. So again, this is a white filter, so it's a little bit different. It's going to look different when you're working on client's skin, but it will give you a little idea of how to warm up pigments, what they look like once they've been mixed. So you know that Dark Heart and Absolute Brown are your darker, more cool toned pigments, and Electric Blonde and Faux Brown are your warmer pigments. So I'm going to add some ungrey to the cooler pigments, and you can watch as it turns them a nice warm brown. What you can do as well, if you have a client that comes back and their brows are a little bit gingery and they're a bit too warm, is when you remix the pigment, you can just add a drop of Absolute or Dark Heart if you think it's necessary. I would tend to add Absolute, and that's going to really cool that pigment down, and it's going to take that gingery tone out of it. It's really important to get to know your pigments, so have a little play around with them, mix the colours, get to know them and get to know how they look once they're mixed, and you'll feel much more confident when you're working on clients.